18-year-old Jennifer Lloyd sat in her ancient world history class with 12 other students. They were all falling behind in their studies for various reasons. Jennifer's problem was a lack of focus on anything associated with, well, school. Her mind often wandered to worlds outside of the cold stone walls of the academy, and she wished she could be anywhere but in its confines. A rebellious free spirit with hair of fire red to match, Jennifer was paying absolutely no attention to the lesson her teacher, Mrs. Frederick, was delivering. She tried hard to keep her eyes open during the lengthy monologue about civilizations of the past. Meanwhile, she's thinking about making her own history. Mrs. Frederick, quite elderly and bad-tempered, spoke with a shrill, harsh tone which made listening to her voice even more difficult. Jennifer eventually tuned her out and became lost in a daydream. She was imagining herself as the founder of her own all-girl rock band. Something like that was practically unheard of in 1960s England, but leave it to Jennifer to challenge the status quo. She stared out of the window at the trees gently swaying back and forth like a crowd of concert-goers cheering and waving their hands. Envisioning herself performing on stage, her eyelids grew heavy. Entranced by the oscillating trees, she dozed off. Mrs. Frederick stopped short when she saw that Jennifer was fast asleep in class. The other students all turned and looked. Mrs. Frederick shrieked Jennifer's full name, Jennifer Whitney Lloyd, to wake her up, but to no avail. Quite the heavy sleeper, not even the most shrill cry of an angry teacher could roust the sleeping Jennifer. In fact, her blissful dream placed her at an award ceremony where she was about to be recognized as Best New Female Singer and Guitarist from the UK. Instead of Mrs. Frederick's attempts to wake her up, she only heard the voice of the MC in her dream, announcing Jennifer's name to go up and accept her award. Mrs. Frederick shouted at Jennifer again, "Jennifer Whitney Lloyd." But she did not stir. The classmates all watched with bated breath. They could always count on Jennifer to liven things up in class. Now, although Mrs. Frederick was small in stature, she was quite menacing, actually just straight up frightening to most students. She slowly began walking towards Jennifer like a mountain lion stalking a rabbit. The classmates began to giggle. Feeling watched, Jennifer woke up and jolted hard, startled to see Mrs. Frederick's enraged and weathered face very close to hers, with eyes as cold as the underside of the earth. They stared at each other for what seemed like an eternity twice over. Everyone in the room froze while Mrs. Frederick's grisly gaze burned into Jennifer's soul. Just then, Jennifer suddenly felt the uncontrollable urge to yawn during this awkward stare-down. And so she yawned right in Mrs. Frederick's face. The classmates giggled louder. And if that wasn't bad enough, Jennifer accidentally said, "Sorry, Mrs. Ancient," in a failed attempt to apologize. Oh, it was bad. Mrs. Frederick was white hot with fury. Jennifer immediately started gathering her belongings, already preparing to remove herself from class. Mrs. Frederick shouted at Jennifer to get out, of which there was really no need because she was already walking out the door at this point. Straight to the headmaster's office she went, which was her usual weekly stop. Jennifer casually strolled down the crowded hallway, totally unbothered by what had just transpired in her history class. She chewed gum and blew bubbles without a care in the world. The collar of her school uniform shirt was unbuttoned, and the bottom of it hung outside of her skirt. Her necktie was loosened, and her socks were slouched down around her ankles, as all formalities of dress were thrown out of the window. Known for her razor-sharp wit and multiple run-ins with faculty, other students in the hall waved hello and whispered about her as she passed by. Jennifer was a strikingly beautiful girl, and although she was known as a controversial legend around school, she chose to be a loner and had always been that way. When she reached the headmaster's office, she swung the oak door open, threw her gum in the wastebasket in the corner, and plopped down in a chair in front of him per the usual routine. The headmaster of the academy was sitting at his desk writing notes for an 11 o'clock meeting. He looked up to see Jennifer sitting in the chair before him and immediately rolled his eyes and sighed in frustration. A distinguished salt-and-pepper-haired gentleman in his mid-50s, the headmaster had the look of wisdom, academic prowess, and no tolerance for insubordination. He eyed her above his spectacles that sat low on the bridge of his nose, annoyed that Jennifer was back in his office for the second time in 1 week. He asked her if she wasn't tired of coming in to see him, and she answered in an exaggeratedly surprised way, saying, "Of course not." Unamused, Headmaster put down his pen and began stroking his white goatee in thought. He reminded Jennifer that he had already seen her earlier in the week for smoking in the bathroom. He was not impressed that the title she earned at school was the class comic, and said it gave her no right to disregard the rules of the academy. The headmaster saw that his words had little to no effect on Jennifer, so he sighed heavily again and stood up from his tufted leather executive chair. He removed his glasses and carefully started cleaning them with his handkerchief. He took his time with his actions, more than likely to purposely prolong Jennifer's agony. She shook her head in derision and looked up at the ceiling, wondering how long she would have to watch him polishing those glasses. The headmaster slowly paced the floor and turned his back toward Jennifer. She already knew his lecture would be coming next. He began a long speech about his expectations and reminded Jennifer of her responsibilities as a student of the finest academy in Liverpool. What seemed like an endless scolding, Jennifer decided to entertain herself by mouthing the exact words he was saying, having heard them so many times before. But he was on to her tricks. Headmaster quickly spun around to face her, knowing she was mocking him. He leaned down and looked her in the eye, in no mood for her games. With his tone more severe and ominous than usual this time, he told her that her days at the academy were numbered, and that she had better straighten up and get on the ball. The headmaster was not kidding.